So now we're talking about the Reconstruction era again, and we're looking at the constitutional changes after the Union won the Civil War. The three big boys are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Now let's look at the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment ended and outlawed slavery in 1865. The one caveat is that it does state, except if it's in basically if you're arrested or in prison, not jail, but if you're actually in prison, you've waived your right. So people interpret it as you could work for free. And we've seen this for years that prisoners have been used from everything from making license plates to little manufactured goods to actually doing in the South, they used a lot of what are called chain gangs. Or in Alabama and Mississippi, they would have these guys with heavy chains on their ankles and they would build roads and ditches and break rocks. And it was hard labor, really difficult stuff. And they didn't get paid for it. Now, usually most places they give you something small, like a couple cents to the hour. It might just be like 15 or 20 cents an hour so that the guys can use the money to buy something in the commissary or like the jail store, the prison store, so they can buy candy or treats. Okay. Very interesting amendment, and the other part of it is it does state, and they made it clear that if somebody's born in America, because you have to think of the time, if it was an African slave that was born in America, they're boom, ultimately they're instantly made an American citizen. They wanted to make that clear. So there wasn't any questions later on, well, are African Americans really citizens? The answer is yes, if they're born in the United States, but that also extends to everyone. Anybody that's born in the United States is automatically an American citizen under the 13th Amendment. The next amendment is very, very important as well, the 14th Amendment. I think many minorities, people of color, and women and LGBTQ would even argue the 14th Amendment might be one of the most important amendments that affects their lives directly. Originally, it didn't include all those groups, but now it's been applied in quite a few situations. So the 14th Amendment gives you the Equal Protections Clause. It says everybody has equal protection under the law in the United States of America. And we'll talk about this more in government. In government, it has to be incorporated into the states. So if something is determined to be in the 14th Amendment and in the Constitution, even though it doesn't say it explicitly, like it doesn't literally say anything about marriage in the Constitution, that's a really good example because under the Oberfell versus Hodges case in 2015, the LGBTQ won a very, very important case for them that said that homosexuals can get married. So a man can marry a man under the 14th Amendment, and it's protected under the Equal Protections Clause. And under the legal doctrine of incorporation, we have to incorporate that in all the states. So that's why when Kentucky and Alabama refused to marry gay people, it was against the 14th Amendment, and the Supreme Court had stated that. So therefore, they couldn't do that, and that was a big battle. And still, in some parts, there's probably still some counties and local governments that are still fighting that today. But it is against the Constitution for them to do that. It's not a state right. Okay, then you have the Due Process Clause, which is this idea that everybody is due a process to when they're being arrested or they're being charged for something. So you can't automatically go straight to prison just because a police officer wants you to. They have to follow a process, and we'll get into many of the rights you have under due process, but you have a right to an attorney, for example. You have a right to a trial. You have what's called habeas corpus, where they bring your body to court, where they bring you physically in front of the judge, and the judge himself, not just the police, have to tell you what you're being charged with, so you actually know what's wrong or what's going on. And also, you have a right to bail. You can get bailed or leave if a judge sets bail for you. So there's a lot of rights and processes that we're not going to need for this unit, but we'll go into that later, especially in government. Okay. Now, the one trick here is that it was all men under the Constitution. So, ladies, this did not extend to you. And we'll talk about property rights especially. They wanted men to have the property rights, not the females. And the right to vote, which those are civil rights. Civil rights are your legal rights under the law to vote. And women did not have any civil rights. And we're looking at the 15th Amendment, and that's the same case as well. This gave all men the right to vote in America, but did not apply to women. So again, women did not have these civil rights, but men did. They didn't have equal protection under the law, and we'll find out why when we get to the feminist unit We talk about women's history and trying to understand their struggle and their fight for civil rights. And now we even talk about much more on the human rights issues, where we talk about Black Lives Matter, and you say, well, yeah, but the civil rights have been achieved. Like, people of color can vote now, or they have to be treated equal under the law, and they do have a right to due process. But what the Black Lives Matter movement is pushing is this idea that they're saying, well, that may be true. Legally, you have those laws in place. That does not mean they're being followed. So just because something's the law doesn't mean that police officers are following the law. Like, under the Eighth Amendment, you cannot have any cruel and unusual punishment. But if police officers are mistreating African Americans, and there's a lot of evidence that's true, and we have video of it now, that they're treating them disproportionately compared to white people, then that's a human rights issue. Even if the laws say they can't do it under the 14th Amendment, it doesn't matter. We got to do other things to fix the system, and that's a human rights issue. And that's why it's probably the biggest human rights movement in the history of the world, which is really interesting. So let's look at these pictures real quick. On the right side, again, we have this narrative, the story that was told at the time and still told. And I think you can find textbooks, especially in the South, that tell this narrative of the cult of the lost cause, where the South had never really, it wasn't like the Civil War wasn't a lost cause. They fought it, but it wasn't for a lost cause. And they were fighting for states' rights, and they were fighting hard with all their hearts for their culture and to keep the South together. And, it wasn't just a lost cause. And that's why Robert E. Lee needs a huge statue in the middle of the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, which was taken down and resulted in violence, and the guy hitting people with his car. And that was just like, we have to take a stand on that one. If you're the ultimate right, like, we can't allow this story to stop. And then if you're on the other side of it, and the Black Lives Matter are like, whoa, no, we gotta get rid of these guys. This guy was fighting for slavery for the South. Robert E. Lee was not a Union soldier when you're building this statue. He was a traitor. If you see it on that side, that he was a traitor to the United States. And the fact that you're building a statue to a traitor that lost a war, and the war is over. The South has to be reunited with the North under Reconstruction era, and that's why we're reconstructing the country. We're putting the country back together, and we're putting the South back. We're reconstructing, putting the South back together, because it's just utterly destroyed from all this fighting and war for 5 years. And if you believe the cult of the lost cause narrative, the whole war is about states' rights and had almost nothing to do with slavery. And when the Northerners came down, they just tore up the South. The carpetbaggers, these rich white Northerners came down, these businessmen that made a bunch of money off the South, and they used these stories. And not to say that somebody didn't make money off the South, but is this completely blown out of proportion? Also, you can see this cartoon that's depicting this idea at the time. And you have two groups being represented and depicted very offensively. On the left side, you have appears to be a black Union soldier. And then on the right side, you have an Asian immigrant, probably Chinese because of the clothes style, a Chinese immigrant. And what they're doing is they're made caricatures. So if you ever go to like Six Flags or you go to Carnival and they draw your faces silly, that's how they would depict people racially at the time. Like they're cartoons or they're silly characters, which is really offensive. And what they're doing is they're devouring something or someone. And I want you to think who that is. And at this time, that was like the ultimate, still is, a big symbol of the United States in cartoons is Uncle Sam, which is the kind of the U.S., America. And you see that the black Union soldier and the Chinese immigrant are eating Uncle Sam. They're destroying our country. And it says, the great fear of the period. So this is what's happening to America. The Chinese are building a transcontinental railroad. They're uniting the East with the West Coast. And then the Union soldiers are down in the South under Grant. And General Grant's declared martial law. And there's black Union soldiers going around. And they're putting down the Klan because they're a terrorist organization at the time. And who was killing thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of lynching African Americans and killing them. And this is horrible, it's just out of control, and the North's just doing whatever they want to the South, is one story. But on the other side of the narrative, and the story that I think most historians would tell you, and most books and textbooks are going to tell you, the full story you're going to start to go, look at the left side of this picture. You see this lineup of African American men, and they're voting. For the first time ever, African American men are voting. And this is a lot of power and respect. They're being treated as human people. Under the 14th Amendment, they have equal protections. Slavery is banned. That in itself is an amazing step in the right direction. Men have the right to vote. They have a right to go to court. You can't just arrest and kill them or beat them to death. So Reconstruction on that point of view was a pretty positive time. Like even South Carolina was in fact had a majority African American populace, and they voted the men, and they even had a majority in the South Carolina House of Representatives. They had African American representatives in their state capital, and that was driving and scaring the heck out of Southern white people, because many of the white men who had fought for the Confederacy, they had lost their right to vote. That was one of the consequences of the Civil War at first. Now we're going to find out this all starts reversing though. As soon as Reconstruction over, this all changes. Now I'm going to share this link. This is a really great album. It's got all the amendments, but you should hear the Cash Money song about the 13th Amendment. It's really cool. Now I want you to look at this concept. So James Baldwin, he says, I attest to this. The world is not white. It never was white. Can't be white. White is a metaphor for power. I want you to really think about that. So James Baldwin is a very famous African-American author, civil rights movement leader. He's actually right there in a picture with his good friend Martin Luther King. He was close to the family. When he talks about when Martin Luther King died, how much it really bothered him. But he was an activist, a poet. He used a lot of his writing and his words and literature he talked about race, sexuality. He was a openly gay man, and he talked about how homosexuals are mistreated at the time and how he was treated as an African American male in America. He wrote a lot of interesting stories and made some interesting points. And in this one, I want you to think about I attest to this. The world is not white. It never was white. Can't be white. White is a metaphor for power.